I hope you're well. A couple hours ago, there was headline news, Mr. Producer. I believe it's the last day of Ramadan, Eid, I think it's called. And it's Islam's holy month of fasting. And there was a shooting that occurred in Philadelphia in the Parkside neighborhood. An Eid event. Almost 1,000 people were there. It's a lot of people. And there were gunfire. People got hit. It was a terrible scene, as a matter of fact, in a park. And the media were all geared up. They brought on ex-FBI agents, ex-police, and others that were, if not suggesting, certainly implying that this was a shooting because it was Ramadan, the last day of Ramadan, and 1,000 Muslims were gathered in this one place. Now, let me make something abundantly clear. I have nothing for contempt for anybody who kills anybody. Innocence, period. I have no problem whatsoever with people who practice their faith peacefully. Period. Period. And the funny thing is, people talk to me. The person I work with at my bank is a Pakistani Muslim. People that I know quite well, quite closely, and all sorts of things that we do around this house and we do around our studio, Muslims. And they are disgusted, many of them, with the Islamists because they threaten them too. But stereotypes are created by the media. So when you criticize Islamists, notice I didn't say Muslims. When you criticize Islamists, terrorists who push terrorist ideology, the media want you to say Muslim. Now, the media were all geared up to hit this morning, noon, and night. It's disappeared totally from the headlines now. Why? Well, now we know more facts. Two factions, reports ABC News, pulled out guns and started shooting at each other at the outdoor gathering, according to Philadelphia Police Commissioner Kevin Bethel. 30 shots were fired. A 22-year-old was shot in the stomach during the gunfire. Juvenile self-transported to a hospital with a gunshot wound to the hand. Both were in stable condition. An officer at the event shot a 15-year-old boy who was allegedly armed with a gun. According to Bethel, the teen was shot in the shoulder and leg. The officer recovered the firearm and transported the teen to a hospital. A child also fractured their leg. They were hit by a responding officer's car. 5 people have been arrested in connection with the shooting. They include the 15-year-old who was shot by the officer, as well as 4 suspects, 3 juveniles and an adult, who fled the scene with guns, multiple guns. According to Bethel, 5 weapons were recovered. A motive remains unknown. But they said 2 factions pulled out guns and started shooting at each other. So the headlines disappear because the media wanted it to be something else. They certainly thought it would be something else. That's not to say that can't happen. There's a lot of very evil people. A lot of very evil people. It's not to say it can't happen, but it didn't. The media, the American media. There's a lot being said today about a gentleman named Yuri Berliner. He's a very courageous man. He's a veteran reporter, employee of PBS, of NPR rather, and an editor. And he's worked very closely with people who work there for a long time. And apparently he wrote a piece in the Free Press, which I want to get to momentarily. But here's what amazes me. He doesn't tell us anything we didn't know. The fact is that he's very brave in coming out and telling us, reinforcing what we already know. So I would tell my colleagues in TV and radio, it wouldn't hurt you. It wouldn't hurt you if you would actually educate and inform yourselves more. Over 500,000 of you read a book called Unfreedom of the Press. You know what's going on in the press instinctively. It's common sense. And you also know the history of it and the extent of it because you read. They don't. Unfreedom of the Press is about how those entrusted with news reporting in the modern media are destroying freedom of the press from within. Not government oppression or suppression, not President Donald Trump's finger-pointing, this was written several years back, but present-day newsrooms and journalists, indeed social activism, progressive groupthink, Democrat Party partisanship, opinion and propaganda passed off as news, the staging of pseudo-events, self-censorship, bias by omission, and outright falsehoods are too often substituting for old-fashioned, objective fact-gathering and news reporting. A self-perpetuating and reinforcing mindset has replaced independent and impartial thinking. And the American people know it. Thus, the credibility of the mass media has never been lower. This book could easily have been 10 times in its current length, but that would make it unreadable for most. Nonetheless, I mean, even at its current length, it's unreadable for some, apparently. Much ground is covered and research undertaken, and many authors and scholars consulted as the history of the American press and the evidence of its decades-long demise are carefully examined. The purpose of Unfreedom of the Press is to jumpstart a long overdue and hopefully productive dialogue among the American citizenry on how best to deal with the complicated and complex issue of the media's collapsing role as a bulwark of liberty, the civil society, and republicanism, ranging from the early newspapers and pamphlets promoting the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, to the subsequent party press and transparent allegiance to one party or the other, to the progressive approach of so-called professional reporting, and now the ideologically driven advocacy press of today. So for those of you who read this book, this is not new. What's new is the gentleman had the courage to come forward, for which he should be thanked. Unlike the early Patriot press, today's newsrooms and journalists are mostly hostile to America's founding principles, traditions, and institutions. They do not promote free speech and press freedom, despite their self-serving and self-righteous claims. Indeed, they serve as societal filters attempting to enforce uniformity of thought and social and political activism centered on the progressive, aka American Marxist ideology and agenda. Issues, events, groups, and individuals that do not fit the narrative are dismissed or diminished. Those that do fit the narrative are elevated and celebrated. Of course, this paradigm greatly influences the culture, the government, and the national psyche. It defines a media-created reality, whether or not it has a basis in true reality, around which individuals organize their thoughts, beliefs, and in some cases, their lives. Yet there is mystery and opacity that surround all of it. And if one dares to question or criticize the motives and work product of this enterprise or aspects of it, that is, the reporting by one or more newsrooms, the response is often knee-jerk and emotionally charged, with the inquirer or critic portrayed as hostile to press freedom and the collective media circling the wagons around themselves. Bears remembering that the purpose of a free press, like the purpose of free speech, is to nurture the mind, communicate ideas, challenge ideologies, share notions, inspire creativity, and advocate and reinforce America's founding principles. That is, to contribute to a vigorous, productive, healthy, and happy individual and to a well-functioning civil society and republic. And the media are to expose official actions aimed at squelching speech and communication. But when the media function as a propaganda tool for a single political party and ideology, they not only destroy their own purpose, but threaten the existence of a free republic. It is surely not for the government to control the press, and yet the press seems incapable of policing itself. We must remember, we are not merely observers. We are the citizenry, we the people, for whom this nation was established and for whom it exists, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and I quote, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and serve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Hence, we must demand a media worthy of our great republic. And we begin the process by informing ourselves about those institutions and individuals and their practices and standards who, by their own anointment, proclaim the high-minded obligation of informing us. That's the 3-page introduction on freedom of the press. It only gets better after that. So it is somewhat curious that this book that was number one on the New York Times bestseller list for a month or two, maybe 3, but sold over 500,000 copies, received virtually no notice on any conservative newsroom other than on the internet. Why would that be? I'm not saying opinion makers, I'm talking about newsrooms. Now comes forward Yuri Berliner, a veteran of the Public Radio Institution, and he says the network lost its way when it started telling listeners how to think. And you already know this. What's unique here is that somebody's come forward, still works at NPR, so he comes forward at potential personal attack against him, and that's what they've started to do. And he says in the free press, and I will note that the New York Times opinion page or book review section never reviews my books. Not when Barry Weiss was there, and not since. And that's okay. They would just trash him anyway. You said, the stereotype of the NPR listener, an EV driving, worldly playing, tote bag carrying, coastal elite. It doesn't precisely describe me, but it's not far off. I'm Sarah Lawrence, educated, was raised by a lesbian peace activist mother. I drive a Subaru, and Spotify says my listening habits are most similar to people in Berkeley. I fit the NPR mold. I cop to that. So when I got a job here 25 years ago, I never looked back. As a senior editor on the business desk, where news is always breaking, we've covered upheavals in the workplace, supermarket prices, social media, and AI. It's true NPR has always had a liberal bent, but during most of my tenure here, an open-minded, curious culture prevailed. We were nerdy, but not knee-jerk activists or scolding. In recent years, however, that has changed. Today, those who listen to NPR or read its coverage online find something different, the distilled worldview of a very small segment of the U.S. population. If you're conservative, you will read this and say, duh, it's always been this way. But it hasn't. Actually, it has. Maybe not at NPR, but certainly in the last multiple decades. For decades, since its founding in 1970, a wide swath of America tuned into NPR for reliable journalism and gorgeous audio pieces with birds singing in the Amazon. Millions came to us for conversations that exposed us to voices around the country and the world, radically different from our own, engaging precisely because they were unguarded and unpredictable. No image generated more pride within NPR than the farmer listening to Morning Edition from his or her tractor at sunrise. Back in 2011, although NPR's audience tilted a bit to the left, it still bore a resemblance to America at large. 26% of listeners described themselves as conservative, 23% middle of the road, 37% as liberal. By 2023, the picture was completely different. Only 11% described themselves as very or somewhat conservative, 21% middle of the road, 67% were very or somewhat liberal. We weren't just losing conservatives, we were also losing moderates and traditional liberals. An open-minded spirit no longer existed within NPR, and now, predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects America. That wouldn't be a problem for an openly polemical news outlet serving a niche audience, but for NPR, which purports to consider all things, it's devastating, both for its journalism and its business model.